Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. So as we've been talking about this unit on citizenship and government, we have talked about what it takes to be a citizen, the process to become a citizen, what the responsibilities are of a citizen. Today we're going to start moving a little bit more to how the citizens and the government interact with each other. So the weapon that people have in a democracy is the ability to vote. All right. And as we have talked about in other units like Challenges to American Ideals, talked about the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And while it would be nice to say that solved all the issues dealing with people's right to vote in the United States, it is not. It just gets more complex on how people can have their vote feel like it doesn't count. But it is not as cut and dried as it has historically been with discrimination. So we're going to talk about some of the current issues today, when this is recorded in 2021, 2022, over the ability to vote in the United States, with some specific examples of questions that still remain with the legitimacy of voting in the United States. All right, we got a lot of cool stuff to talk about. Let's get started. You have to get started talking about voting with a census, because without a census, things don't work right in a democratic republic. So here's what a census is. Every 10 years, the federal government needs to know how many people exist in America. How many people are here? So every 10 years, you'll get mailed in the mail, they'll call you, they'll contact you, they'll literally come to your door if you haven't filled out this form, then they need to know who's here in the country, all right? Now, in today's society, it seems like, they want all my information, get my bank account. And rightfully so, if that sends off your spidey sense, probably good. You're understanding the digital world that we live in. You want to be safe. So this kind of throws some people off when they're not familiar with it. But this happens every 10 years, and the government needs to know who you are and basic demographic stuff. It does ask, has historically asked what race you are. I would imagine if it's not already not part of the census, they will stop asking it in the future, I would imagine. Or you have the option of just not replying to those questions. But the reason they need to know who's here in the country and where they live at is because of our Congress, the legislative branch particularly. All right. So we have talked about the Electoral College in the past, basically, which is what elects the president. How big your population is determines how many votes you get in the presidential election. That number of votes in the Electoral College is the same amount of representatives that each state will have in the legislative branch, in the House of Representatives, and Congress. So we're going to talk about North Carolina here because North Carolina has the best stories here by far. But for this, we'll talk a little bit about Georgia here at the end as another example at the end of the lesson. But so let's look at North Carolina here. North Carolina, based on this map, all right, has 13 representatives, all right? So they have 13 votes in the Electoral College. You have 13 representatives, all right? It's called reapportionment. Say North Carolina lost, there's 535 people. If you add them all up, you're like trying to do the math here. There's 535, all right? 435, 100 for the Senate, sorry. 435 here if you're adding them up. So North Carolina has 13 of that 435. Say a bunch of people had moved from North Carolina down to South Carolina since the last time it happened. Well, if North Carolina's population had gone down, but South Carolina's had gone up, North Carolina would lose a number and South Carolina would gain a number. But whatever happens, you have to basically divvy out 435. If every state grows in population, then it's all based on a ratio in who has more and who doesn't in population. And that's called a reapportionment, where you want to make sure in that 435 people that are in the House of Representatives, that it is evenly representative of the population of the states. So it's like a big old math problem here. And they have to know every 10 years exactly how many people are in the United States so that they can effectively make sure each state has the appropriate amount of representatives, all right? So the question here is, why is it so incredibly important to have an accurate count of Americans in our democratic republic? So why is the census so important? Why is it important to know how many people are here? And we had just got done talking about that. So pause me, answer that completely, and we're moving on. All right. So who draws congressional districts? This is probably something, if you are completely new to this whole situation that we're going to talk about today, you probably didn't think about that when I just told you the last thing. So there's 13 people get elected in North Carolina to go represent North Carolina at the federal level. Well, how do you elect those people? The House of Representatives, there shouldn't be any overlap, meaning each representative represents one specific group of people in North Carolina. So North Carolina will be divided into 13 sections, and each section votes for who they want that has to live in their section to go represent them in the House of Representatives in the federal government. All right? Cool, Mr. Wagstaff, this seems really boring. Oh, stay with me. I wish it was boring. It gets unboring, and that's kind of sad because this gets wild. This is still happening today. Anyway, all right. So who gets to decide what these districts look like? Like, you're probably thinking, Mr. Wagstaff, just put a grid over it, 13 sections, and call it a day. Well, the population density is different in different places, so you know, not all districts will be the same size. Everybody kind of understands that. So who's in charge of actually making these lines for the districts? All right? And I know you're probably thinking this is boring, but I promise you, stay with me because it gets wild here. It's one of the craziest things to me that still exists in modern politics. All right, so who gets to draw the lines for the Congress at the federal level? All right, the states do. All right, the states draw the lines for federal elections. The right to enforce voting and make sure voting takes place and all that, that's actually on the state, not the federal government. The federal government cannot come in and make lines for a state for a federal election because it's all about federalism, separation of powers, state governments, federal governments. So without allowing the federal government to have too much overreach, because you can see what happens when these districts aren't drawn fairly. It's given to the states. The states draw the lines. And here is a list of the states. They're like perfect little squares here. But North Carolina here, you can see the legislature draws the boundaries, meaning the state legislature. Most states are like that. You can see there's a commission here and things. Different states have different ideas. But in North Carolina, as in most states, the state legislature draws the congressional districts for federal elections. All right. So in 2021, there's time to redraw districts. Because say North Carolina goes from 13 to 14. Well, where do you get that from? You just have to basically wipe away most of the districts and redraw them. All right, take some out of the other ones. Okay, Mr. Wagstaff, so I got your state legislature. They draw boundaries for the congressional districts of the people that will be voted on to go serve in the federal government. Okay, well, what does this have to do with anything? All right. So in 2021, whoever controls the state legislature politically gets to draw those boundaries. In this case, it's the Republicans, all right? Different, like Virginia's the Democrats. So we're going to talk about a concept of gerrymandering here in a second, which seems like it's a crazy word, and the actual what it is even crazier. But the question here is, before we start talking about that, is why do state legislatures draw the voting lines instead of the federal government, even for federal elections? So pause me, answer that completely. We had talked about that, and we'll move on. All right. Gerrymandering. All right, so the definition of this is drawing a congressional district to favor a particular party. And you're like, yeah, but Ms. Wagstaff, if you have to have 13 districts in North Carolina, and the population is there, if everybody still gets to vote, there's no way they can make it unfair to one political party over another, right? Well, you be the judge of that. So this is a map of North Carolina with population density, all right? So the red areas, all right, those are cities. That's your Raleigh, Greensboro, Winston-Salem, Charlotte, kind of right here in the center, all right? Historically speaking, all right? And when I say historically speaking, I would say 99% of the time, if there is, assuming there's a 1% somewhere, cities typically have a larger percentage of minorities. Cities typically vote more liberal, and in modern society, that means cities typically vote Democrat. Rural areas typically vote Republican or conservative, historically speaking. All right, and that's a pretty well-known, caveat. All right, but you can see the cities are spread out through all over the place. So basically, however you draw these districts, you're going to have a city in it, which has a large population of people. So it looks like if you just made a grid, you would have some places that have rural and some places that have a city. That would seem fair, right? You have about the same amount of people that are conservative and liberal. And North Carolina, the reason North Carolina is so important for this example, North Carolina is pretty equal in Democrats and Republicans. All right, it's called a battleground state at this point. There is an equal amount of people on both sides. All right, so these districts should all be pretty equal, right? Right? You're with me? You're like, Mr. Rice, if you've been acting like there's something cool getting ready to happen, and you ain't showed us nothing. All right, here we go. What's of this? We went to straight Inkblot Test here. Is that what we're doing? No. This is gerrymandering. This is in North Carolina. This is actually a district in North Carolina, District 12. What? If this was on a map, the black area is actually one congressional district. Inside that single congressional district, you have Durham, Greensboro, High Point, Winston-Salem, and Charlotte. All cities, all the high minority population, and they're all put into a single district. This is what it looks like on a map, the green area. Congressional District 12. Look at that district. So all those people vote for one representative. Now the argument is by the Republicans who put all these people that would typically vote against them into the same district. You're like, well, so this district's like 100% Democrat. They said, well, the reason we do that, okay, is so that their representative, which would clearly be a Democrat, will be looking out for their best interest. So that is how this idea, and we'll talk about how it's crazy the more you look at it, has been argued that it could be a positive. Because the people in this district, that is literally gerrymandered, they just cut it up to make sure all the Democrats are together. Because guess who's in all the other districts? The Republicans. All right? So, but the argument is by cutting it up this way, all these people are guaranteed to have a representative that is not only a Democrat, but looks out for their best interest because they're all city folk. And they're looking out for city folk interest. All right? So, once again, look at this map. They cut that swatch out of all the cities and put them together. All right? And you're like, all right, is that bad? Well, as far as the state goes, in 2010, before they really got crazy with it, and District 12 has been like that for a long time, that in 2010, the Republicans had 54% of the vote in North Carolina. Total. So if everybody that voted in North Carolina, 54% were Republicans. They only won 6 seats, and 7 went to Democrat. So when the Republicans, because keep in mind, even though you're like, okay, so there's more Democrats and Republicans. At the federal government, at the state government, it becomes Republican, all right, pretty quickly after this. So when they redid it in 2011, all right, the 2012 election was very different. 49% of the people in 2012 in North Carolina that voted Republican. However, because of the way these districts were designed, right, and they had been redesigned. I mean, you can see up here in the mountains when they're cutting out actual and putting them in different districts, knowing that you're watering down Democratic strongholds. Even though only 49% of people in North Carolina voted Republican, they won 9 of the 13 seats because of gerrymandering, because they were able to put all the Democrats into single districts. All right? You're like, that can't be right. You're right. Depending on your opinion of it, does it help the people in these districts because they clearly have a elected representative that does represent them? But as far as the national level, North Carolina is not effectively representing the popular vote in North Carolina. But the Supreme Court, called the 12th district, the one we've been talking about, and the 1st district, clear examples of racial gerrymandering. All right? They're basically disenfranchising black voters because they can't affect the rest of the state. They are basically all hemmed together and they get one single vote. So you're like, okay, well, it got fixed, right? Well, no, it didn't. Because in 2018 they redrew them, and it's basically the same. Or in 2018 is basically the exact same thing. That the Republicans, all right, got 65 of the votes, and the Democrats got 55. Even though the Democrats, and this was in the state House and Senate. I went from federal to local, but they use the same maps. They do it at the state level and they do it at the federal level. More Democrats voted in 2018 than Republicans, but the Republicans clearly won because of the gerrymandering. And you're like, but the Supreme Court came out and said that's wrong. Exactly. But the federal government can't step into a state and redraw their lines for them. They can slap them on the wrist and say, no, go redraw them again. Because the state governments, because of federalism, are responsible for redrawing their own lines. So there's no way the federal government can go in and draw the lines for them. There is probably a martial law type situation where that could happen, but that is such an overreach and would be drastically unpopular to happen. I don't imagine that would happen. But North Carolina continuously is put in the news because this continues to happen. In 2020, the House map, all right, still heavily favored Republicans because you're putting like Greensboro, Winston-Salem, Charlotte, Raleigh, and Durham. You're putting them all in the same way. Democrats, so the Republicans won 8 seats with only 49.4% of the overall vote. Democrats, who got more votes than the Republicans, got 5 seats. So 8-5, and the one with 5 seats literally got more votes. But again, the argument is by having gerrymandering, all right, and these is the last attempt they have to try to correct it, and District 12 changed. But it is still set up the same way, and it's still getting challenged in the courts because you would think the amount of representatives you have reflect your popular vote, and that's not happening. But the benefit, claims the people who make the lines, to this is by putting the cities together, all right, those cities will have a representative that represents them. If they put the cities into a whole bunch of, country folk, and it turns into, a country folk person is elected, they won't be looking out for the people's interest in the cities if it's in that same congressional district. So they try to claim if you lump everybody together based on their own demographics, then they're guaranteed to have a leader that represents them in the federal government, which that's a good argument. But the argument against it is, yeah, but we only got 1, 2, 3 leaders up there that represent us, and the rest of the state, which has not as many votes as us, has 8 representatives in the state. So therefore, at the end of the day, North Carolina is not fairly reflected in the federal government based on their population. So it is a question. It's a constant battle in the court systems. So the question here is gerrymandering fair? What do you think? And there are definitely people on both sides of it. Don't let me sway you in one way or other. But do you think it helps voters or it hurts them? And explain your view on that. And there's not a right or wrong answer to this. This is common debates that happen today in society all the time. All right, so answer that completely, and we're moving on. So the next thing that we need to talk about is voter ID laws. This is a hot button issue now. So it seems silly on the face, like, hey, if you're going to go vote, you got to have an ID to show up and vote. Cool. Like probably a lot of people are like that have not voted. Like, I didn't used to have an ID. No, because they know who's in their district, and you show up, you tell them who you are, they have you on the name, and they mark you out. You get to vote once. All right. And you're like, but what if Billy shows up and says he's Joey? What happens then? Well, folks, that's called voter fraud, and Billy's going to prison for it. So, can't do that. And you're like, all right, but people aren't good people sometimes, and so it will still happen. You're right on that. But, and this data is actually really surprising to me, people typically don't stand in line, because guess what? If Joey shows up and votes for Billy, or Billy shows up, whichever one I said, whoever got sent to jail is the guy who lied, not the person who got voted for. If they usually don't stand in line to vote for somebody else. When I say it usually doesn't happen, here's what I mean. From 2000 to the year 2020, there was 1 billion, with a B, votes cast. Of those, there were 31 out of 1 billion credible allegations of voter fraud. All right? 31 in any single election wouldn't have affected any election in the country. All right. Now, not saying that's not a problem, but here's where the controversy comes in, because the states are like, we're afraid this could be an issue, even if it's a preemptive solution to a problem that doesn't really exist. We want everybody to have an ID before they go vote. All right. Well, then people are like, that's racist. And you're like, oh, what? How is that racist? Well, depending on how you look and how your state is set up, to get an ID, it has to be a state issued or federal issued ID. If your state requires you, like a driver's license, to go pay to have an ID, all right? If you have to go to the DMV, pay $10 to have an ID, not just a driver's license, but just an identification card, that is technically requiring a voter ID is a violation of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which says poll taxes are illegal. You can't have to pay to vote. Requiring people to have an ID means they have to go buy one, which would constitute them having to pay to vote, which you couldn't do that. A lot of states have responded to that, who want to do the voter ID laws, as making IDs free at the DMV. Okay, that's fine, great. Well, it appears that people are like, well, it's aimed at keeping African Americans from voting, and you're like, how is that possible? This is where it's surprising, all right? So even if the ID is free, you still have to have a birth certificate and these other things that if you don't have them, you do have to pay for. So people are still on the Voting Rights Act of 1965 argument that you can't make people pay to vote. So I did not know these stats until I was looking them up for this. 25% of African Americans who are legal to vote do not have an ID. Now, these are stats anybody can look up, right? Only 8% of white people who are eligible to vote don't have an ID. That's a random statistic, but that is a big gap. So people are claiming this, you're trying to prevent something that's not even a problem, which is voter fraud. Because it looks a whole lot like you're trying to find a niche to keep black people from voting. And they're like, I don't know. Well, a lot of states have passed this law, all right? North Carolina is one of them. So I want you to look at this graph here for a second, and I'll talk about it. So, in the general election, places that had a strict photo ID law in the general election, or no voter, in the general election, there really wasn't that much of a change in the general election, all right? But primary elections, all right, places that had a strict photo ID, there were less black people that voted than would have apples to apples in places that were no strict voter ID based on the percentage that were eligible to vote. All right, that is not a difference in white people voting. So even if it's a small difference, the only group not negatively affected by having a strict voter ID laws is a single demographic, white people. This is the type of stuff in society that you look at and you're like, okay, does this mean it's racist? Or is this just trying to find a demographic in a situation in which this changes? Because while African Americans, and that was the argument, African Americans only 25% don't have an ID, in the general election, it doesn't really affect, but it does negatively affect Hispanic voters, Asian American voters, mixed race voters, a lot of groups that historically are Democrat. But white voters, and white voters, because it's still, the recording of this is still the majority of the population, are Republican and Democrat. But it's interesting. The only group that is not negatively affected by voter ID laws and their voter turnout tends to be white people. So does this make it discriminatory? And that's the current issue that we have, even in such a small amount like this. Is it worth looking into? So the question is, explain how our voter ID law, which appears to be a simple fix to very secure or to verify secure elections, can be interpreted as discriminatory towards minorities. So pause me, answer that completely, and we're moving on. So the last thing I want to talk about here, and I want to point to Georgia here for this one. This is another one that people are like, don't let this one creep up on you. This seems odd. So in places where disenfranchisement of African Americans had taken place for a long time, poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses. Civil Rights Act of 1965 basically did away with a lot of that and said there has to be poll places, like black people have to have access to voting, all these places, and so that happened. In 2013, the Supreme Court says, I'm pretty sure we've moved past all that stuff. So there's a random rule that got lifted in 2013 by the Supreme Court that says that, because prior to this, to move a polling place, a place to go vote, you had to have permission from the federal government to make sure that they weren't doing anything shady. Well, it hadn't been a problem since 1965, it's 2013. They don't need to ask permission before they move a polling place. Ooh. Since 2013, from 2013 to 2019 actually, 1,600 polling places have closed in places that previously they would have had to have permission for. These places didn't close, but as soon as they didn't have to ask permission to close them, they just closed them. That's in Georgia. There are 7 counties in Georgia in which there is only one available place to go vote, and there used to be multiple. So what happens? All right. So this is a graph of Georgia, and this happens in different places around the country. But I'm going to pick on Georgia here for a second. Statewide, the amount of people standing in line to vote at a single polling place has increased, especially if you're a minority. In minority-heavy areas, there's less polling places, meaning if you're black in Georgia, you have to wait in line longer to vote than a lot of white people in different areas of the state. You know what one of the number one things that keeps people from voting is? It's waiting in line. So is this just a coincidence? Is there legitimate reasons for this? Is this a funding, volunteer situation? It could be a lot of things. But the location of polling places and the closing of the polling places, present day, still concerns people over, is this a new form of passive-aggressive discrimination, or is it just a basic supply and demand economic situation of why these places had to close? But the question here is, why is it concerning that so many polling places in the South closed as soon as those districts no longer had to ask permission from the federal government to do so? All right, answer that completely, and that's what I got for you today. I'll see you guys tomorrow.